Hello, everyone. Welcome. We're going to start. We're going to try to start on time because we have a lot of information from our presenter today. I'm going to start by letting you know that you are on the webinar for severe mental illness and dismantling mental health barriers, culturally responsive strategies for supporting Asian Americans. I want to give a warm welcome to Julianne Lee Verdugo, and I'll give you a little bit of background on her. And I also want to thank our technical support and host, Chris Yang, who is the director of the Mosaic Cross-Cultural Center at San Jose State University. So just wanted to get started here. We have people who'll be logging on. We have quite a few people registered. I want to give you a reminder, if you look at the QR code here, and I believe Chris will be dropping again the link for the pre-event survey. If you could take that, we really would appreciate it. And certainly our funders would also appreciate your filling out the pre and post survey. So I'm going to begin by introducing myself very briefly. I'm Dr. Kathleen Wong Lau. I'm the University Diversity Officer at California State University, East Bay, here in the Bay Area in California. I'm also co-PI on this grant for the Ohana AANHPI Behavioral Health Center of Excellence. It is funded and supported by SAMHSA. We are also partnered with other entities as well. Next slide, please, Chris. Great. So our Center of Excellence is one of the 4 centers of excellence, with one just recently awarded for the Latin community. We're the AANHPI Ohana Center of Excellence, and we are a technical support center for people who provide services as well as support, as well as to community-based organizations and to individuals with lived experience and individuals seeking behavioral health support. We were funded and developed in partnership with the state of Hawaii's Department of Health, and the 2 academic partners are CSU East Bay and San Jose State University. And of course, our community-based partner is Papaola Lokahi in Hawaii. Right, next. So I'm going to quickly introduce our guest speaker today. I think that the information that she'll be providing will be very useful for everyone. It's very timely. Julianne Lee Verdugo is a licensed clinical social worker, and she provides outpatient psychotherapy for services to adults of color. She has a lot of experience working in different types of settings. And she has led and contributed to various research projects focused on topics including schizophrenia, spectrum disorders, and other types of disorders. She has led and contributed to various research projects focused on topics. She served as the project coordinator for a National Institute of Mental Health funded grant conducting community-based participatory research on suicide prevention for adults with schizophrenia in a community health setting. She's currently a PhD student studying social welfare at the University of Washington, focusing on research areas of racial and ethnic health disparities, Asian American and Latinx, mental health, severe mental illness, and culturally responsive service delivery. She got her bachelor's degree at University of California at San Diego and her master's from the University of Michigan. Before I introduce her, I do want to remind everyone that this presentation is specifically on Asian Americans and is not one that is on APIs, meaning that there is not specific information on Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders, just so we understand when you're attending this, that is specifically on Asian Americans. And so I'd like to introduce you to Julianne Lee Verdugo. I do want to also say I'm speaking from the ceded lands of the Muwekma Ohlone here in East Bay in California. So Julianne, take it away. Thank you and welcome.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Wong. I am getting my presentation set up. I hope everyone can see it okay. And yes, thank you so much for the warm welcome, and thanks for everyone who is here for attending. So as Dr. Wong mentioned, I'll be going over the following topic of severe mental illness and dismantling barriers to mental health care. So without further ado, I do want to start off with a land acknowledgement. As mentioned, I am currently at the University of Washington, so I'm currently calling in from Seattle. So I just want to begin with a brief acknowledgement that I am on the traditional land of the Duwamish people, past, present, and future, and want to honor with gratitude this land and the Duwamish tribe. So I acknowledge the Coast Salish peoples of this land, the land which touches the shared waters of all tribes and bands within the Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. And if you are able, please take a moment to acknowledge the traditional land that you may be currently located on. And importantly, I always find it helpful and meaningful to position myself and acknowledge where I'm coming from when I'm thinking about this work and engaging with my professional identity and practice. So I'm coming from a clinical psychology and social work background, and having worked in very specific research areas, community mental health, schizophrenia spectrum disorders, outpatient practice. So I want to be humble and acknowledge that not only will this workshop be quite short, there's not enough time to go over the extreme breadth of this topic, but also that I am here to be part of collective learning. And I hope this opens some conversations. I hope this is the foundation for many of us, and definitely it will not be all encompassing. So I want to be mindful of my own positionality and experiences and know that others may have had different experiences with folks. And I welcome hearing that and hope we can collaborate and share knowledge with each other to best support one another and our clients and patients in this work. So a quick agenda of what this hour will look like. I hope to provide a quick overview on severe mental illness, what that looks like, some barriers to mental health care for Asian Americans, and then we can jump right into some culturally responsive strategies and applications, with concluding with some resources and next steps. My goals for this, I hope all of you with the wide range of backgrounds for folks calling in, I hope there will be something useful for all of you here, that you can leave this today naming some distinct symptoms and characteristics of severe mental illness, that you can name some various barriers to healthcare access for Asian Americans related to this population, that you can list some foundational techniques and strategies for engaging with this population in practice, whatever type of practice that may be, whether it's social work or counseling, therapy, community organizing. And finally, I hope this will be an introduction for some tools and opportunities for reflection on what culturally responsive care and approaches can look like. Again, not all encompassing by far, but it's a start, and I really appreciate all of you for your time today. So let's jump right in without further ado. And sorry, quick note as well, if we don't get to questions at the end, please feel free to reach out. And if you have questions along the way, the hosts will let me know as well. But I look forward to hearing questions at the end to make sure I can deliver all of the content as promised. So without further ado, here we go with a quick overview of what severe mental illness is. This is an umbrella term for a variety of diagnoses. The important combining factor is that it would be a diagnosis characterized as requiring chronic or lifelong treatment. So you may have heard the terms serious mental illness, persisting mental illness, chronic mental illness. Those are all referring to the same things. The idea is that there is severe impairment to an individual's ability to complete their activities of daily living, of their relationships, life goals, other dimensions requiring consistent care. So the most common ones that you may be most familiar with include schizophrenia spectrum disorders, and bipolar disorders, and major depression disorder. And how does this apply then to Asian Americans? So although rates of severe mental illness have been increasing annually, so we can see in the SAMHSA reports in 2021 and 2022, rates of schizophrenia, for example, bipolar disorder have increased. However, service utilization continues to remain disproportionately low. We know that Asian Americans access mental health treatment significantly less than folks in the general population. And this could be because of a number of factors in the literature. So prevailing mental health stigma is very much one, other cultural factors, but this is important to continue to seek further understanding. We do currently have limited awareness or recognition of even what mental health conditions may be among Asian diaspora groups, and the importance of these growing numbers leads to then, how can we better engage with this population? What would be helpful? So I want to, although this isn't interactive, I want to invite all of you to think about the following exercises and think to yourselves, do you think this is a fact or a myth? This first one being, people experiencing symptoms of psychosis are usually dangerous or violent. What do you think? So this one would be a myth. In fact, people with psychosis are usually not violent at all, and if anything, are more likely to be at harm to themselves. But as we may be familiar with, the media can often misrepresent this and make it seem like schizophrenia and people with psychosis are dangerous, violent, and a risk to others. This can be perpetuating harmful stereotypes about this population, which of course we want to be very mindful of and do not want to further any misunderstandings. So how about for the next one, fact or myth? People with psychosis have split personalities. This one is also a myth. The definition of split personalities better aligns with the diagnosis of dissociative identity disorder. So psychosis, in fact, we'll get into this shortly. Schizophrenia as a word means split mind, being there's a split in the experience of reality, basically. And that is where this misconception may originate from. How about this next one? Experiencing psychosis means that someone has schizophrenia. While this one is a bit more technical, this is a myth purely because psychosis is a symptom, while schizophrenia is a diagnosis due to an ongoing experience of a combination of symptoms, meriting what constitutes a disorder in our DSM-5. But finally, what do we think about this last one here? Someone who is experiencing psychosis must be hospitalized immediately. So while this, of course, is a case-by-case basis, the overall answer to this one would be it is a myth. Someone who is experiencing psychosis does not necessarily always need to be hospitalized. In fact, they may not be at harm to themselves or others. And as we will get into if there is time, sometimes the experiences are positive. We might be experiencing pleasant voices, for example, and that's something we don't want to stigmatize or immediately jump to conclusions about what would be helpful for someone. So I will run through these pretty quickly in terms of the nitty-gritty of the criteria, and then we'll jump into the culturally responsive strategies and what that looks like. This may be review for many of you, but as we just talked about, psychosis is the symptom. So when someone experiences conditions affecting their mind, leading to some loss of contact with reality. And this is a period where a person's thoughts and perceptions may be disturbed. They may have difficulty understanding what is real or distinguishing that. Schizophrenia, in turn, is a diagnosis when this is experienced consistently. And you may be familiar with the category in the DSM of schizophrenia spectrum disorders. Schizophrenia is just one very common one. There are others to include schizoaffective disorder, pre-psychotic disorder, schizotypal disorder, and so on. For purposes of this overview, I just included a brief criteria overview for schizophrenia only. But as you know, there are more than just this diagnosis. Just looking at this really quickly to give you an idea of how to characterize this very broad diagnosis, you can see that there are many different combinations that someone may present with if they have a schizophrenia diagnosis. The important piece here being that there needs to be 2 or more of the following, and 1 must be from the first 3 items. The 3 items here are delusions, hallucinations, and disorganized speech. So importantly, this says a lot about how presentations can range widely. Someone may not be visually or auditorially experiencing stimuli that other people do not, but maybe they have beliefs that are indisputably false to others. There are different ways that someone can present with this. So it's important that we can acknowledge there's a wide range of presentations that can affect misunderstanding or interest in treatment, and so on and so forth. So it's really important. I then go into considerations here about language. So we might use these words in our day-to-day lives, and it's important to think about how this may be contributing to and perpetuating certain stigmatizing beliefs about folks who live with these diagnoses. So if at all possible, I encourage you to avoid certain words just in our day-to-day lives with our friends and family. Instead of saying that someone is schizophrenic or crazy or that this was insane or wow, that person is delusional, right? Those are very stigmatizing ways of just throwing those words around because words have power. So instead, especially if you're talking about a client, consider person first language, like person with schizophrenia, person affected by schizophrenia, person with psychosis, someone who is experiencing hallucinations, experiencing delusions. So that'll be a theme throughout the rest of this. But I wanted to also include this really exemplary quote as well by Esme Wei-Jun Wang. She's an incredible author, and in her memoir, The Collective Schizophrenias, she actually talks about her own journey with schizoaffective disorder. So the following quote is a pretty good one. She writes that schizophrenia terrifies. It is the archetypal disorder of lunacy. And the words psycho and psychotic are used to refer to everything from obnoxious ex-girlfriends to bloodthirsty serial killers. This is a pretty good quote about how this diagnosis can be very deeply misunderstood and also misportrayed. So it's important to understand it and to be able to dismantle these kinds of impressions when it comes to folks who are living with these symptoms and these experiences. I'm going to now jump into bipolar disorders as one other facet of SMI, severe mental illness. And of course, we won't have time to get more detailed through all the other ones, but we hope this overview is helpful to just give us a picture of what it looks like before jumping into strategies. So I have a couple more of these exercises now. If you would like to, please think about the following. Do you think this is a fact or a myth that bipolar disorders are mainly characterized by manic episodes? So while this one may feel like a trick question, this would be a myth because not all bipolar disorders involve mania. We'll get into how some involve hypomania instead. But also, it is also characterized by the lesser seen depressive low lows after the very high highs. So important to think about the expansiveness of what bipolar disorder can look like. And how about this following one, fact or myth, that drugs can induce psychosis or mania? So this one is actually a fact, and it's important to think about the role that substances and psychotropic medications can have on a patient or client's experience and presentation. So important to be assessing for the full picture when we're treating someone or working with someone, just to get all the information that we can and all the considerations that we can. And how about this one? That manic episodes are fun and help someone be more productive. So you can see I wrote this one to seem easy or seem misleading. Of course, it can seem like someone's getting a lot done when they might have a burst of energy and just get a lot of things done in a short burst of time. But of course, manic episodes are deeply distressing and hard and lead to really difficult recovery times. And it's important to not minimize that or find ways to quote unquote see the bright side and so on and so forth when it comes to these experiences. So very briefly, again, here's the DSM criteria for bipolar, where now with mania, the definition would be a distinct period of unusually and persistently elevated, expansive, or irritable mood and increased goal-directed activity or energy. You can see here, I won't go through all of this, the few examples of what a manic episode can constitute. So decreased need for sleep, increased talkativeness, distracted easily, inflated grandiosity, increase in goal-directed activity. These are all ways that mania can be experienced. So just to give you a quick characterization of how this can look and how it can present. Again, many different combinations. So some quick considerations here. There are experiences of other forms like hypomania, which does not necessarily involve hospitalization, but of course also includes depression. There are different bipolar disorder categorizations, just like with schizophrenia spectrum disorders. And of note, there can also be bipolar disorders with psychosis specifiers. So someone may have, for example, bipolar 1 with psychosis. And this just means the main distinction is they only experience psychosis when they're experiencing an episode of mania. So again, the big takeaway here isn't to have all of that clinical language memorized, but to be aware that it can look different for different people and to, again, avoid stigmatizing language here. So joking about, oh, I feel so bipolar, oh, I'm so manic, and saying things like, that's crazy, that's mental, that's insane. That's language that, while is very natural and commonplace, can be really harmful. So just gentle invitations for all of us to be mindful of the things that we say. I also wanted to share this following quote by the author Claire Bien, who is a phenomenal writer. She is a Chinese American woman who writes about her journey with schizophrenia in her memoir, Hearing Voices, Living Fully. So this quote is about her own journey with the cruelest voice after multiple voices she was experiencing was her own, of how difficult it was to live with her diagnosis and perform at different levels and kind of adjust her way of life. So she's wonderful, highly recommended. I have some resources from her in the end in my resources list. So I find it helpful to talk through psychotropic medications real quick before we jump into culturally responsive strategies, because we'll talk about how westernized psychotropic medications can be in practice. So just 3 more of these. What do you all think of this one? Fact or a myth? If you start taking psychotropic medications, you will be on them forever. So this one is a myth. This is not necessarily the case, but it is understandably a common misconception and potentially a point of apprehension before starting treatment. Like, of course, it would feel scary to potentially have to be on something for the rest of your life. But of course, as many of us are familiar with, that is not necessarily the case with medications and how long we are on them. How about this second one? That medications will change your personality, fact or myth? So also a myth, though that's a very understandable concern. But of course, medications don't change who we are, but merely alter our experience with certain symptoms, right? Or maybe reduce the severity of them, but it won't change our way of being. Though this, of course, is another one that can look different based on what medication someone may be on or prescribed and the interactions. So it's a lot to think about. It makes sense that folks may have concerns about treatment initiation in this way. I have one more here. So thank you for humoring me. What do you all think about this one, fact or myth? That medications will cure the mental health condition. So this one, unfortunately, is a myth. Medications are not the cure-all, but that doesn't mean they are not necessarily helpful. But it's important that this isn't the misconception that if someone starts medications, everything will go away. There's often other supports, resources, services, support groups, therapy, for example, things that can help someone increase their quality of life and really find a meaningful way of living and navigating with their symptoms. So I talked about that just now because it's important to think about how we situate ourselves in terms of westernized barriers to treatment. So just now, I went through diagnostic criteria and medications, both which are often a pretty westernized focus when it comes to treatment and recovery. This may not necessarily align with various Asian diaspora values. For example, even the language of someone having an illness or a disorder, that may not align for some folks. And this is understandably a potential barrier to treatment, to being interested in mental health services. And it can also inform mistrust and misunderstandings of medications, of services, and healthcare overall in the US. So I share this because it's important just to keep in mind that westernized mental health practices may not be acknowledging other forms of treatment that might feel more aligned for folks and more important, more integral to their sense of healing and most meaningful ways of navigating their symptoms and what they're experiencing. So homeopathic or non-Western forms of treatment. So I'm very excited now to jump into what are some potentially culturally responsive strategies that we can all engage in and find helpful. Of course, not all of these may land, not all of these may feel relevant. I hope there's something in here for everyone that you can find speaks to you and your practice, however it is. So just to jump in real quick, it feels helpful to start with an exploration of what culturally responsive care looks like, as we may hear that term thrown around often and may not actually think about what it could look like and what it means. So to me, again, from my positionality, here are a few things that come to mind for me when it comes to what does culturally responsive look like. So for me, there's an importance of acknowledging broader context of systemic inequality and discrimination and how that impacts our clients. There's an importance to recognize that our biases can recreate structural inequalities and impact clinical work. So potentially, if we're leading with westernized training, that already is automatically a bias that we're going into the therapy room with, for example. And to me, culturally responsive care means ongoing self-reflection, being really critically self-aware of what we do not know, and constantly seeking to better learn and leading with cultural humility in practice. I found these following reflections from a great culturally reflective toolkit that I cite below. I found these very helpful. So these are just a few examples of self-reflections that all of us can engage in when we're kind of thinking about how we approach and situate ourselves in our professional work. So modalities, for example, what frameworks do we really hold in our practice? Who were those developed by? Who were they developed for originally? What attitudes do we have about our clients? How do we talk about our clients with our colleagues, with our supervisors, especially clients of different identities? Do we talk about them differently? How about approaches? If we serve a client who doesn't share the same identity as ourselves, do we acknowledge that? Are we thinking about differences? And how do we approach it? Do we have different beliefs around maybe clients that are younger or older than us? Do we ask every client their pronouns? Do we assume their gender identity, however implicitly, based on how they present? And beliefs about therapy. Are we conscious of what we think our role is? For example, as a therapist, do we think we are solving someone's problems, that we are being their saviors? Do we feel superior to our clients, like we know more than them? So these are all some good examples of not that there's a right or wrong answer, but more how we can be critically reflective and intentional about what we're bringing into the space. So a few more here. How many clients have we maybe worked with who are not of the same race as us? How often do we think about our race with a client? What assumptions are we subconsciously making based on their intake information or simply their demographics? And of course, financially, what income brackets are we primarily serving? What insurances? These are all just a few out of many, many wonderful reflection questions that can really center us in terms of how are we thinking about these things in terms of culture, and what are ways we can seek to continue to improve and grow and collaborate with others collectively. So I want to introduce a scenario, a case here, and then we can talk about some strategies that may feel relevant or how we might approach this case. So please imagine for yourselves that you're approaching a first session with a 45-year-old cisgender immigrant and Chinese woman that you know, based on the intake, she is diagnosed with schizophrenia, with a schizophrenia spectrum disorder, and was referred by a family member. This client is mandated to come to therapy, and she speaks some English. So if you take a moment, just visualize that as you have an upcoming session with this person. And what are some things you might be thinking about? Here are a few strategies and initial thoughts that I wrote down. And these are based on different approaches as well that I cite in the resources section at the end, like different ways of leading with culturally responsive intake and in therapy practice in general. Like, what factors are you considering? What questions do you have for this client? Are any biases coming up just with that information that you know? And how about any insecurities or doubts? Anything you feel unsure about just with this information you received? Are there people you would want to consult with that's coming to mind right away? Does seeking consultation come to mind for you right away, or supervision? And What about the following do or do not? I have a few of these. And important that there's no right or wrong answer necessarily, but I hope talking through these is helpful as kind of showing ways you can engage intentionally with different clients to best support them and get to know them from a client-centered framework. So do or do not, what speaks to you? Would you ask explicitly about what the client's cultural background is, what their experiences are with their racial identity? So sit with that for a moment. And I have one more here. Would you try to relate with the client based on shared identities, such as same race, same age range, same presented gender identity? And I ask those because it's very important to build trust first and foremost with your client, especially when it comes to severe mental illness, that they may already be not feeling heard or believed by everyone else in their lives. So we do not want to contribute to that and be one more person on that list. So the client is always the expert. But I just asked you all if you would ask about the impact of their culture on their mental health. The answer to that is overwhelmingly yes in the literature, but it doesn't necessarily mean asking, hey, how does your culture impact your symptoms? In fact, it may be asking based on how they define their culture, their beliefs. Do they have any spiritual connections? How do they experience health and well-being? Are there traditional or preferred practices that they may want to talk more about in care with you? Acupuncture, for example, herbal medicines. And I also add, it's very important to offer, if at all possible, to arrange for interpreters if this would be relevant and helpful for a client. So even if they speak some English, right, it's always helpful and very meaningful to be able to offer that they can speak in their native language to engage with care as best as possible. So I have a couple more here, and I hope these are fun since this is a webinar. So tried to make it mildly interactive and engaging. For this one, how do you think in terms of what you would do? Would you offer to involve trusted family members or loved ones in treatment? And would you alter aspects of the session to increase client comfort, kind of based on their preferences? For example, would you be comfortable letting a client sit in your chair, not the couch? Would you offer to go for a walk instead of sitting for the hour? Would you offer to drink tea? I ask those two because there are, of course, agency allowing, there are ways that we can get creative and flexible in terms of best engaging with our clients to best meet them where they are at. An important one would be how, for many Asian diasporas, collectivism and a collective focus on relationships and family members, that's often a big part that may not always be captured by westernized treatments. So it's important to at least offer to involve, importantly, trusted family members or loved ones in care. Of course, as well, for severe mental illness, having as many social supports as possible is really important for quality of life when SMI is inherently very isolating, given that no one else may be experiencing the same symptoms you are. So it can be really, really lonely. Social relationships are everything. Exploring culturally responsive ways to increase comfort. Again, if you're able to, given the context of your organization. Being able to do a walk and talk or offer a cup of tea, and really recognizing there are different ways to do care, to do mental health treatment that may not be the traditional way in the US that really speaks to someone who isn't comfortable with that, isn't familiar with that, doesn't feel aligned or connected with that. The last thing I put on this slide here is around intentions, that it's important to be very honest and transparent as best as you can. Since again, there may be experiences with mistrust and paranoia, understandably. So building trust with your client first and foremost should be the most important thing above all in terms of how treatment can look. I hope this all makes sense in terms of being accepting, being non-judgmental, being empathetic, and being supportive and being strength-based. Again, this is coming from my positionality now as a social worker, where strength-based care is very much a framework that many of us lead with. But accepting feels like a big one to talk about because while we may not understand and have direct experience with, for example, a hallucination of someone following us and being at our door, we can imagine how scary and terrifying that would be. So, empathizing with the feeling, even if this is something you can disprove, you're not going to disprove that. You can empathize with how freaking terrible that would be and leading with that so they can feel less alone. You know, that would be a really scary time. They probably aren't hearing that from others if other people are trying to convince them it's not actually happening. The last point right here that I put, use neutral and non-threatening topics. This just feels like an important side note to mention because talking about these topics, like what they are experiencing of feeling persecuted, that can be really agitating, understandably. So if that is coming up at all in a session, being able to switch gears and kind of switch to talking about something more neutral and gentle, like what is their favorite thing to do during the day, best part of their day, do they have a hobby they really enjoy, kind of talking about that to be mindful of following where your client is at and letting them lead. This was an important one. What comes up for you all on this one? Would you or would you not provide reality testing with the client, which is basically discussing factual evidence to disprove their beliefs? And this one's very, very important. I've talked about this in trainings before for psychosis and schizophrenia. That one would very much be a do not, especially in the beginning, of course, case by case basis. But overall, with the literature, utilizing reality testing is not necessarily helpful and, in fact, can contribute to further mistrust and be hard to build a relationship with your clients. So, again, I love to say empathize with the feeling. And if it comes up later or feels relevant, if the client is in a place to talk about their delusional beliefs later and counter them, you can have them lead the way there. But importantly, stay with the client and remain curious. Demonstrate genuine interest. If they're telling you a long story, you can empathize with the feelings through what they're experiencing and describing. And all of these other things, these are important to consider. Be aware of potential distractions, like voices they may be experiencing while sitting with you, maybe leading to them being silent or responding in a different way. So let's jump into if this session has been continuing. Let's add further to this exercise. Now you're talking to this client, they're not interested in talking about their symptoms. They do not believe they need treatment. They're really only there because their family members have been really, really hassling them to go. And they're very disengaged, asking questions with short one-word responses. I bring that up because it's quite important to talk about anosognosia, which is basically when someone may not have insight towards their diagnosis, and it is a neurological condition. I have the definition pasted right up there, where the patient is unaware of their psychiatric condition. This is important to bring up because it is very, very common. About half of patients, for example, with schizophrenia experience this. So it makes sense that they may genuinely not recognize that they have symptoms that could be helpful to treat. And that is okay. That's part of what's coming up for them. So it's important to not engage in reality testing, right? Further, because this might be present for them. It's important to prioritize building trust in your relationship and focusing on making sure their basic needs are met, that they are safe, and having social connections. Again, social support being everything for people who are often very isolated and very, very lonely, understandably, with experiencing these things and no one else believing them, right? So important to think about all of that, matching the client's interests. For example, I cite a paper here where the team looked at talking about therapy as job coaching, like kind of ways to then use that time to help the client attain a goal of performing better at their work. So they never really talked about specific diagnoses or goals of treating certain symptoms, but more actually made it relevant to what the client named they would like to do with the time. And an important final thing, the final bullet point here, I actually took it from a previous training at Ohana from Dr. Parasu Yamoto. It was an incredible conversation about how if someone may not be in a place to acknowledge their situation, it doesn't mean you're giving up on them if you stop pushing for them to get treatment or to start medication. You can find different ways to engage with them and respect what they're saying, and that does not mean you're giving up on the person you care about. So I felt like that was an important one to include. I'm also aware I'm jumping through all of this very quickly. These slides will be available after the presentation, and I welcome further conversation as well after these slides. So if any of you are familiar, this is a model that's really, really great, especially for folks who may not have insight towards their illness. It's called the LEAP model by Dr. Xavier Amador, who's an incredible clinician and has done a lot of work with schizophrenia and their caregivers and family members. While no studies have looked at this model particularly for Asian Americans, it has been demonstrated to be very, very effective and helpful for the general population. So feels worth mentioning here briefly. It stands for LEAP. LEAP stands for listen, empathize, agree, and partner, constituting LEAP. So listening to what the person is saying, empathizing with the feeling, agreeing on something that both of you could agree with. So not necessarily that the delusion, for example, is true, but you can agree with how the client wants to do their job differently, and they want to find a way to engage better at work without feeling distracted by a certain delusional thought that keeps getting in the way of them focusing at work, for example. And then finally partnering from there, like agreeing that, okay, we can still meet for session and let's focus on that, the job goal. Like making it very much collaborative, and you don't have ulterior motives here. You do want to really partner with your client in this way. I, of course, am aware that talking about all of this makes it seem like super easy and straightforward, when of course severe mental illness is rarely that. So this is all assuming that the client is not at risk and not a danger to themselves or others, that their basic needs are met, that they are in a place to engage with goals like that. So of course, you'll always want to assess first and foremost any immediate risk factors, any safety risks, protective factors. If you're doing treatment or services online or over Zoom, on the phone, always confirming a physical location just for safety purposes, if in any event you needed to make sure they were okay if something happened, maybe if an emergency happened where they were. But that being said, you would then want to really honor what the client wants. Do not push for medication if they don't want it, not hospitalizing them if they don't want it, right? If, again, there is no immediate safety risk. This is purely because as social workers, as licensed practitioners, we do have the mandated obligation to make sure that there's no immediate harm in place. So here's a final question here. What do you think? Do you think this is true or false? Success with this client that we've been talking about means they will start taking medications and acknowledge their diagnosis. So as you may guess, this one would be false. Success can look very different because the client may want certain goals out of their time with you. So priorities for treatment, again, assuming safety is there and basic needs are met, is that you have a client-led collaborative relationship, that you have built trust. They had experience trusting a provider and having a good experience with healthcare, which means a lot for marginalized populations. Priorities would be involving trusted social support. So again, that they have more protective factors, more people in their lives, and that you have addressed feasible goals relevant to the client's interests, what they really wanted to focus on. And finally, you are prioritizing keeping them safe and then helping them live a meaningful life. Above all, it looks different for everyone, and it may not always be what you imagine as meaningful, or, quote unquote, successful outcomes. It depends on the client and what they want. So thank you all so much for listening to all that. I have a few final closing notes, and then I'll share some resources at the end and hand it back off to our lovely folks at Ohana. So just a few conclusions here on being culturally responsive, right? We talked about what that means and how that's a very broad umbrella for a lot of different actions and reflections that we can take. So I hope you all can think about what it really looks like for each of us in the work that we're doing in every space that we're in. What questions can we ask ourselves? How do we commit to continued professional development and growth, right? For example, I identify as a lifelong learner. I am nowhere near where I want to be in terms of how comfortable and how informed, how knowledgeable I would like to be in my work. So I will continue to seek knowledge and seek collaboration and learn as much as I can in everything that I do. Importantly, acknowledging what we do not know and seeking to learn, especially from our clients, because they are always going to be the experts of their lives. We will never know more than them about their lived experiences. Even and particularly if we share certain identities, we can then feel like we might know more. But in fact, that could be even more dangerous to assume, because no two people are alike, no two lived experiences are alike, even with similarities. And finally, I have two other points here about involving peers and those with lived experience as much as possible, like truly seeking to learn from those who have been there. And of course, we never want to ask our clients to educate us. This is stuff we want to do outside of the therapy space or the time we're with our clients. We want to seek this education and continued growth to then show up as best as we can with the folks that we are serving. So I have here communities, researchers, and all of us, starting with communities, some strategies. I hope we can engage or contribute to anti-stigma campaigns or messaging around mental health, like positively talking about mental health, sharing out our different narratives, breaking the silence. There's a lot of power in storytelling. So really contributing to community events and building relationships, kind of connecting one another in our various communities that we are in. And for researchers, some strategies here include disaggregating data on Asian Americans. What a broad term for so many intricate and uniquely different ethnic and racial subgroups that we truly are losing so much data, and it's very reductive to combine them all into one category, Asian. And that's something hopefully many future studies will work towards disaggregating and addressing. It's important to collaborate with local and community organizations in research to best understand direct experiences, right? So involving peers and those with lived experiences in the research process. And of course, disseminating findings to a wide audience with simple and easy to access language too. And finally, some strategies to close with for all of us, however we identify whatever role we are in this work or in our personal lives. I hope we will be mindful about not making jokes about mental illness or suicide, being mindful of the language we're using. I hope we can positively reinforce discussion of mental health or openly talking about it, normalizing going to therapy if that's relevant for folks, and generally checking in on loved ones, even if they're not in acute crisis, right? We never know what might be going on for someone else. That feels like a great rule of thumb. We truly never know. And we are not the saviors. That was a question earlier, like how are we experiencing our role? For example, as a therapist, our role is not to be saving someone else. So being mindful of how we view ourselves and the power that we have in that kind of space. And this was really important to close with, being kind to ourselves when we make mistakes or do not know the answer, because severe mental illness can be really tough. It understandably is persisting and lifelong, often lifelong, for a reason. So we might do everything we can in our power to try and help someone, whether it be a loved one or a client, right? And sometimes it might not work out the way that we hope. So I find this is a really important one to remind ourselves about. It's okay to do the best we can and be kind when it might not go the way that we hope, and know that we're doing our best. So finally, as well, empathizing. We do not have firsthand experience all the time, right, with the exact symptom, hallucination, delusion, whatever that may be coming up for that person, but we can imagine. We have the skills to empathize with the feeling, how scary or distressing it could be. And I hope that all of us will seek ongoing consultation or collaboration or supervision, knowledge sharing. We are stronger the more we connect and share resources with one another. Of course, being culturally responsive, again, from my positionality, is remaining humble and not assuming expertise. So I hope that is something we can carry forward with us in this work as well, leading with cultural humility in all that we do. I have a few final reflection questions that I encourage you all to sit with and think on. First being, what does being culturally responsive look like for you? Is anything coming up for you after this that you want to think about? Second, what makes you most uncomfortable currently about working with someone with severe mental illness? And is there anything you would like to do about that? And finally, what are you taking away from this? This was a lot of information. Again, a very broad topic. There's a lot more to this that we could have gotten into. So initially, from this foundational overview, is there anything in particular that you're taking away? My hope is yes, of course. I wanted to wrap up with this quote as well. This is from psychologist Dr. Jenny Wong, who is phenomenal. She's done a lot of incredible work in terms of Asian American mental health and connecting folks to Asian therapists in the US. So her quote here talks about how, as children of Asian immigrants, we may have been told to hide our emotions, family conflicts, the messiness of our lives, and secrecy and shame, which only further isolates and drives us into hiding the pain. She's written a lot on stigma and factors contributing to misunderstanding or not being as interested or sure about mental health treatment in the US. Definitely highly recommended. So these slides, again, will be available later. So if you are interested, I have listed a few websites here specific to severe mental illness or Asian mental health or both. So here are some websites and here are some books. All except for the final two are written by Asian authors. The last two are just very exemplary, wonderful resources on severe mental illness. But these are some great books that I really love and have found very helpful, both personally and professionally. Here are some TED Talks that speak more about severe mental illness. So those are lovely if you're interested in consuming this content through video. And here are the references that I drew from throughout this presentation. So various academic publications and also some pretty good websites with statistics or information, very helpful resources. So that is all available here as well. So just to close, I want to acknowledge and greatly thank Dr. Mi-Kyung Han, my current mentors at UW, Drs. Jane Lee and David Takeuchi, and also the folks at UW, Michelle Brower and Shirley Chu, who helped disseminate this workshop and shared it with MSW students and other social work students at University of Washington. And finally, just a huge, huge thank you to the full Ohana team for having me. Thank you so much to Gwen, to Chris, to Dr. Kathy Wong, and Dr. Han as well, who was my primary point person here. Really, really appreciative of being here. Thank you all. And of course, with that, thank you to everyone here for your time. I know this was an hour that you devoted to being here, and I don't take that for granted. And I really appreciate that you were interested in this topic, and that you wanted to learn more, and that you listened to me and were here for this. So thank you for being part of it. I know there's not much time left, so please feel free to record my email or reach out if you'd like to talk more or talk about any questions. And otherwise, I really appreciated being here. And thank you all so much. And that was my presentation. I'll now hand it back to Chris and Dr. Well. Thank you all again.
Thank you so much, Julianne. I can see from all the comments in the chat that your webinar is very much appreciated, your expertise. And I think the great care and sensitivity and sincerity with which you replied, you presented is really, really appreciated. I want to remind everyone to please take our post-event survey. This is the way that we let our funders and our funding partners, SAMHSA, know about the effectiveness of our webinars, and certainly would be something that Julianne would also appreciate. So please, again, go to, Chris has dropped the link for taking the post-event survey. I just want to also, before we spend just a little bit of time on Q&A, because there is one question, I want to remind everyone that this was presented by the Ohana Center of Excellence. On this slide, you will see there are different ways for you to get involved if you would like to get involved. You can go to our website. You can sign up to be involved. You can sign up for announcements via email, for example. And oh gosh, 3 times and it kept saying the site can't be reached. Oh no, that is really bad. We'll follow up with an email to everyone. So if you can take that survey, would really appreciate it. Great. All right. Okay. So let's, there are some questions in the Q&A. So I think we've got 4 more minutes. One question that's been asked is, what suggestions do you have for patients who are civilly committed with very little choice?
Yeah, that's a really wonderful question. Thank you so much to the person who asked that. Absolutely, you can imagine that's really tricky. And hopefully, while of course it's a case-by-case basis, hopefully there's a way to engage with that client or that patient to get them to feel like their time with you is meaningful or relevant to them, like exploring some kind of strategy or self-directed goal that would be meaningful or relevant, whether or not it actually involves talking about the diagnosis or symptoms, kind of working with them to collaboratively come to an agreed upon solution. So almost like using the LEAP model and partnering with the client as much as possible. So of course, I share all of that as if it's beautifully smooth and straightforward, which of course it rarely is, especially with situations like that. So I know there's much more to be discussed in terms of that. And thank you again for the great question.
Great question. I want to remind everyone we received a lot of messages regarding being able to access the slides as well as this presentation. So within a week, and if we're lucky by Friday, because we know that the people on the other end who are helping us behind the scenes are also busy with all the other projects we're working on for the Center of Excellence, but we hope to have the webinar as well as the slides posted in the archives. If you go to our website for the COE, you can go all the way down to the bottom of the page to browse all replays here. I think we've got about 25 webinars archived there from the Ohana Center, similar to this web on a variety of topics. And for most of them, we have slides that accompany the webinar that you can download as well and share. And so Julianne has generously agreed to share her slides with our on our website as well with our attendees. So you can refer other people also to those archives. And it basically goes to our YouTube channel for our Center of Excellence. Okay, great. So some people are able to open and submit the survey, so please go ahead and do that. I think we have one person who's having difficulty. That's happened in the past. I'm not sure if it's an interface issue with a version of something that you're using, maybe your web browser or something, but we've had in the past a couple of people who've not been able to submit. But please do that survey. We really appreciate it. Any closing remarks from you, Julianne, in terms of final words to everyone as we get onto our last minute?
No, I truly am just so grateful and appreciative of all of you. And again, as I shared in the beginning, it's very much a collective learning experience, at least my experience in this work. I want to learn from others. and hope to continue learning myself throughout the rest of my career. So please don't hesitate to get in contact, or if you want to talk more about anything from my slides, or if you have more to add to anything that I shared. I really, really welcome that, and know that we will all be better for it. So thank
Well,
you all again for being here.
thank
Thank you,
you.
Dr. Wang.
On behalf of our Ohana Center of Excellence, we are so grateful that you were able to provide so much useful information with a high degree of humility and expertise. And it's really great to see someone whose early career who's doing such incredible work and generously sharing it. Thank you very much. I know I expressed what others have chatted about and felt as well. So thank you so much. You will receive a post-event email that will also have a survey to the link. We are also on social media, so you can look at these various platforms and keep up with the events that are going on over the Center of Excellence and resources that we have. Thank you very much. This ends our webinar. Thank you. Bye-bye. Lots of great comments you should read in the chat.